The natural beauty and abundance of wildlife that has existed for centuries in America's West is an important part of our heritage. The California condor is a bird whose history in the American West parallels much of our own experience. Its majesty was first witnessed by the Chumash, the native peoples whose spirits, they say, ascend to heaven on its 9-foot wingspan. The 49ers and Arizona prospectors saw it too when they came this way in search of riches in pioneer days. By the early 1980s, the condor had all but vanished from the skies above California and Arizona. In 1982, only 22 condors existed in the wild. More than 127 exist today in California, Arizona, and Baja, Mexico. Researchers have also learned more about this magnificent bird, particularly about the obstacles impeding its ability to survive in the wild, from habitat loss to collisions with power lines and towers to disease and new knowledge about the effects of lead on condor health. As America's original conservationist, hunters have been a strong voice for responsible use of our nation's wildlife resources for more than a century. Wildlife conservation issues in the West are becoming increasingly more evident. Hunters and non-hunting conservationists are turning to each other as partners, united by a common understanding that healthy ecosystems depend on healthy habitats for game animals.
In the early years, when the observed decline of condor numbers, nobody knew what was going on. They suspected maybe that lead played a role. But when birds would disappear, mind you, they weren't telemetered at the time, so they couldn't follow them as closely. But when birds just kept disappearing, they didn't know. Was it reproductive rates? Were they finding enough food? Things like that. So now we know that lead poisoning probably played a huge role based on the studies that have been done in the past 5 years. By the time the captive breeding program began and they began talks about releasing these birds back into the wild, obviously it took a lot of different players, a lot of different agencies in an effort to get those birds back into the wild. We have 11 biologists on the ground, 5 or 6 daily, tracking the birds. Since 1996, with our first release, we found that in fact lead is the leading cause of death, lead toxicosis. Lead ingestion and the subsequent lead toxicosis is the leading cause of death for condors released in Arizona. So that kind of opened our eyes as hunters and as biologists involved in the reintroduction of the condor as to wow, how much fragmentation actually occurs in a carcass. I, as many hunters, thought that when you shoot an animal, the bullet enters in, and if it shows an exit wound, chances are it didn't fragment, it just blew right through the carcass. But in fact, that's not what happens. And the way we found this out is by taking matters in our own hands, and we began a study in Wyoming. Over a 3-year period, we shot 38 deer. And then we take them whole and x-ray them, and then take the remains after they were eviscerated in the field, x-ray the remains. And basically at each stage, fragmentation occurred. We observed fragmentation. And these radiographs are, I mean, they really tell the story. In the x-rays, you can see the ribs in the thoracic cavity where the animals are usually shot. You can see rib bones, that's bone, and then the more radio-dense or radio-opaque fragments that show up really bright, those are metal fragments. You can see that snowstorm effect of where a bullet hits a carcass and it disintegrates basically in fragments, doesn't disintegrate, but all the way down to microscopic pieces that you can't see. And that's what's interesting. When you break this radiograph down to a centimeter square, and magnify it, it looks just like the larger picture does. These fragments go all the way down into very tiny and therefore more soluble pieces, effectively increasing that lead level, blood lead level for the condors. The condors feed communally, so a carcass that has, say, 200 to 500, 700, 900 fragments in it, condors come onto a carcass and they go to begin eating it, and they utilize existing holes in the carcass that may be created by ammunition. They utilize those wound channels for feeding. So it makes sense that some of the more dominant birds are going to get the lead first. But the point is, 9 to 10 condors in a carcass is not uncommon at all. So you can poison a large proportion of the condors very quickly.
A recent study in Arizona confirmed that while many hunters enthusiastically support the recovery of the California condor in that state, A relative few had heard about lead as a contributor in the bird's decline.
In 2003, there were initial surveys done. There was telephone surveys and focus groups with hunters. And we knew that the overwhelming majority, 83 to 97% of hunters, were willing to take some action to help the condors. But at the same time, we found out that hardly any of the hunters knew that lead was a problem, lead from spent ammunition. They had no idea that it was a problem for condors. One of our actions that we've taken in Arizona is the department is encouraging hunters to use non-lead ammunition when they hunt in condor range. We know that this ammunition can be a little more expensive and some hunters don't know that much about it. So to encourage them, we've actually offered free ammunition to those hunters that are drawn for big game tags within the core condor range. The hunters told us how the non-lead ammunition performed. Of the hunters who cited it in, 97% of them said it performed the same as or better than lead ammunition. And of the hunters who actually harvested a deer with it, 93% of them said that it performed the same as or better than lead. So not only are they helping conserve wildlife, but they're using a high performance ammunition that they all like. And most of them say that they will use it again voluntarily.
Faced with a mounting body of evidence that alternative shot is needed and that more and more hunters are asking for choices, Fish and Wildlife agencies and average hunters are turning to the advantages of alternative ammunition. We talked with a number of hunters who were offered the chance to test non-lead ammunition at the Monterey County Swiss Rifle Club in California in 2006.
The copper, as far as I'm concerned, you have less fragmentation and you have deeper penetration. You have to understand one important thing is, what path will you choose? You need to choose the right bullet that satisfies you. By doing so, you would choose the copper. You want to choose the copper because then there's no lead poisoning in any game or there's no infection. That's what it's all about. That's a fact.
For hunters that are hunting in environmentally sensitive areas, we certainly support their having alternatives or understanding the alternatives available to them in their hunting so they don't pollute the environment. And certainly using non-lead ammunition or using projectiles which do not contain lead in their ammunition for hunting is one of the ways they can do that.
If there are any hunters out there that are kind of skeptical about even wanting to try non-lead copper ammunition, you know, I strongly urge that they try, because I was one of those hunters that was pretty much stuck on lead ammunition, and I was pretty, you know, set on, you know, this is what I'm going to use, you know, as long as they have it readily available over the shelf. But once I tried the copper lead-free bullet, it blew my mind. I'm willing to spend a couple of more dollars, you know, in these next few years just to get that copper bullet. You know, and I know in maybe another 3, 4, 5 years it's going to be equal with it, because it's going to be so much more readily available once people start trying it and seeing that it outperforms the lead bullet today.
Okay, the line's safe.
Based on what I've seen at the range, and as far as bullets that I've recovered from animals, and then the damage that I've seen in the animals that we've shot with non-lead ammunition, I believe that they do produce an effective kill on the animals. And I think one of the positive benefits of the particular brand of non-lead ammunition that we shoot is that it really consistently expands, and you get the same results, you know, time and time again in the field. Well, I just think it's part of our continuing responsibility as hunters and stewards of the wildlife that we are hunting, to continue to manage it in the most responsible way that we can. And, you know, keeping toxic metals out of the food chain is part of doing that.